since the beginning of the spread of coronavirus pandemic in Palestine, the Palestinian government put in place a response plan to fight this pandemic. And due to the very limited resources and the restrictions imposed by the Israeli occupation on the Palestinian territory, the Palestinian government needs support from its friend states around the world in order to implement this plan. And the EU, which is known for its long support for the Palestinian people and the Palestinian government, met that appeal and that call and provided financial aid in addition to other forms, of course, of support for the Palestinian government and the Palestinian people to implement this plan. For more on the topic, I have with me the representative of the EU in Palestine. So welcome to our program.
Thank you very much.
Thank
you very much, Mr. Samad.
And of course, you have announced during your meeting with the Prime Minister Mohammed Ishtaya the financial support provided by the EU to the Palestinian government, and you commended the Palestinian response plan. If you tell us more about this support and about this plan implementation and your support for it, please.
Yes, of course. Just to underline that on the 8th of April, the European Commission has decided to mobilize an amount of 15.6 billion euros for our partner countries in need. And of this amount, 71 million euros will be given to Palestine. These are funds which were initially earmarked for the next 12 months. And now we decided to front load them, to reallocate them, so that they respond immediately to the needs as formulated by the Prime Minister and as also formulated by the UN appeal. So this, and in addition to that, of course, we continue our regular support to the Palestinian people. In particular, of these 70.1 or 71 million euros, 40 million will already in May and June directly go to the civil servants. We're talking about 55,000 public servants of the Palestinian authorities in the West Bank, in areas like health and education and other core state functions. And they will receive the monies which we initially planned to have at the end of the year, and they will receive, I guess, these amounts so that they can meet the dire needs. We also have topped up by 5 million euros the cash transfer scheme for people in need, populations in need. So the most vulnerable can have also a support. We also have given 9.5 million euros in addition to the East Jerusalem hospitals, of which there are 6, in order to be able for them to effectively address the corona crisis, hire people or pay their people, have the medical equipment, have the protection equipment, and have the testing and the treatment facilities. And we also have an amount of 5.5 million, which we give through a mechanism whereby we support small and medium-sized enterprises, including in Gaza, so that they can have access to loans, that the local banks have guarantees that they can actually lend to them, and where we also provide equity investments into these companies so they continue being operational. And then we have another amount of 4 million euros, which we are currently finalizing, which is a response to the UNRWA emergency appeal, so they can hire more people in the West Bank, in Gaza, in the refugee camps, notably health workers, so that they can meet the needs because of the coronavirus crisis. And last but not least, our ECHO program, our humanitarian program of 6.9 million, will focus entirely on the needs in Gaza, both cash for transfer schemes, food support, and health support, and other support. So this is, I mean, in a nutshell, what we do with the 71 million this year.
Yeah, so now we know that many European countries and members of the EU are suffering the spread of coronavirus pandemic. And we know that the economic life there is very much impacted like any other state in the world. How would the spread of this pandemic and its economic impact affect the EU support for other countries, including Palestine, at the time being and in the future?
Well, as you see, we immediately reacted. And as you may recall that the WHO declared a global pandemic of the coronavirus on the 11th of March. It's only 1 month later the EU went ahead and said, this is our support for the international community in need. I'm talking about countries, developing countries. And this is quite natural because we are the biggest provider in humanitarian development aid. We're the biggest trading bloc. We have an intrinsic interest in having our countries being secure and safe and protected and stable and continue to function. They are markets. They are people who cooperate, interact with us, and we need to protect them. It's a mutual interest. So it's not a surprise that the EU immediately took up their responsibilities. But you're right to underline the importance it has for the EU at large. As you know, at one point in time, Europe was the epicenter of the crisis. It first started in China, as you know, at the end of December last year. It moved over to Europe, and now it's in the United States. Some countries in Europe reacted late, others earlier. Luckily, the EU got its act together. We were able to establish mechanisms of cooperation. We created a COVID-19 task force led by the European Commission. Every day as we speak, ministers in all important dossiers and resources meet in order to address the crisis. It concerns transport, it concerns public health, it concerns economic support to households and to businesses and to states. It concerns research, etc., etc. For instance, we are working now, thanks to a 140 million euro grant, on developing a vaccine. We set up joint procurement for all the needed medical supplies and equipment and drugs in Europe, etc., etc. I could give you many examples whereby the EU now works together to fight this epidemic. And of course, this responsibility extends also to our partner countries, so that also they are in a position to be able to effectively address the corona crisis. Blows both on the public health front, but also on the social economic consequences. You remember what happened in 2008 with the financial crisis.
Yes.
When suddenly the entire world came to a standstill, stock markets plunged, and now we have a combination of a pandemic in an unprecedented scale, and we have a financial collapse as well. And it's important that we address this, and that is, I think, important that we, as a global actor, take on our global responsibility very seriously.
Yes, and in your statement, sir, you said that this is a universal pandemic and the world must come together in order to fight this pandemic. And the Palestinians now have their plan, and you commended that plan. So your general view of the Palestinians' response to this pandemic and how they contribute as part of this world to fighting this pandemic?
There is no doubt that we need to commend President Abbas on his declaration of a state of emergency very early on. It was, I think, the Palestinians were amongst the first few countries in the world who did so. It was very positive. And then Prime Minister Stey immediately took very concrete actions. The closure of Bethlehem, control of movement between the governorates and the cities, consequential and very close screening of those cases where you had then at that time even limited testing capabilities, and trying to equip the hospitals and the centers and the quarantine centers with the necessary material and mobilize the necessary personnel. This was very well done. And I think your government needs to be commended for this action. And what I also would like to underline, it's also positive to see that the coordination with the Israeli authorities, which is also important, improved on the spot in order to contain the spread of the virus. Because both Israel and Palestine have not only a common interest, but also a common responsibility in that. Pandemics don't know borders.
Yeah, and talking about the Israeli government and the way it handled the situation vis-a-vis the pandemic, you know that Palestine, mainly the Gaza Strip, is under blockade and a lot of restrictions are imposed in occupied West Bank. So was there any intervention from the EU side with the Israeli government to alleviate these restrictions and try to deliver in order to enable the Palestinian effort to succeed in fighting COVID-19?
We had, first of all, we observed very closely what was happening between Israel and Palestine. Secondly, we had several calls. I was even in one of the calls with Kogat and my colleague in Tel Aviv, and similar talks with the Israeli government, and also at a level between ministers, whereby we conveyed the message of how important it is that the Israeli authorities, as the occupying power, take on seriously their responsibilities, not only in facilitating the entry of supplies of goods and medication and ventilators and other protection equipment into Gaza, and also ensuring that, for instance, all the needs you have in the West Bank are properly addressed. I think this is a key concern. But I would go beyond that. I would really go beyond just cooperation on containing the spread of the virus. It's also about cooperation on trying to address the problem of the widening fiscal deficit of the Palestinian authorities. A country like Palestine, which doesn't actually control its borders, which doesn't have the tools, the monetary and the fiscal tools, to manage its economy and its budget as a typical country would do, which has the capacities because you're under occupation, needs, of course, the cooperation of the occupying power, which is Israel. And this relates to the question of how to make sure that the Minister of Finance in the Palestinian authorities has a sufficient amount of revenues, the so-called clearance revenues, so that he can pay out the expenditures he needs to pay out to ensure that people get salaries, that people get their pensions, that the vulnerable get their social allowances, that you can pay for roads, for health, for education, for energy, and you name it. So this is very important, and we, of course, encourage the Israeli government to take on this responsibility very seriously.
Yeah, and one more question, the final question, sir. The post-COVID-19 era on the political level, because when we talk about Israel-Palestine, we have to talk about politics in addition to the pandemic. What is your expectations as representative of the EU vis-a-vis the Israeli-Palestinian relationship? Especially, we hear many statements by different Israeli officials, including the current Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, about the annexation of large parts of the West Bank to Israel.
Well, as you know, the EU position is crystal clear on that. Unilateral annexation even is completely out of the question for the EU because it violates all the internationally agreed parameters to which we signed up before the United Nations and as EU. There is not a single EU statement where you don't see a reference to the importance and the necessity of reaching an agreement on two viable states, where we have a democratic, prosperous, independent Palestine state living next to an Israeli state in peace and prosperity. This for us is our mantra, and we support this. We support this politically, we support this diplomatically, and support this financially because we are the most important donor to the PA and to the Palestinian people at large, with about an amount of 600 million euros every year, the member states and the EU together, which we spend for the Palestinian people, with the hope that this will enable the Palestinian government and its people in the future to play a role in order to have an independent, viable state, in addition to, of course, what we're doing on the diplomatic front.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time and thank you for all that information.
Thank you very much, Summer.
You're welcome.